At around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound outside my window. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I listened, I realized it was something else whispering. It was faint, almost like the wind was carrying voices, but it was too clear to deliberate. My stomach turned as I crept to the window and peeked out through the blinds. What I saw made my blood run cold. The same figure was standing just outside my yard. Its head was tilted slightly, as if it were listening and it wasn't alone. It looked like it was talking to someone, but there was no one there. Just the figure standing in the faint glow of the streetlight, its shadow stretching across the grass. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my ears. I grabbed my phone and called the police. My voice was shaking as I told them someone was outside my house. They told me to stay on the line and that officers were on their way. It felt like forever, but the police arrived quickly. I watched from my window as their patrol car pulled up, its lights flashing. 2 officers got out and approached the figure. They called out to it, their voices firm but calm. The figure didn't run or resist. It just stood there as they cuffed it and led it to the car. One of the officers knocked on my door to let me know they had the man in custody. I asked if they knew who he was or why he was there. The officer hesitated before saying, "It's strange. He's been missing for years. We think he's been living in the woods all this time. He's not talking though." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing with questions. Why had he been following me? Who or what had he been talking to? The officer assured me that they would take him in and figure out what was going on, but his words didn't do much to calm me. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I kept thinking about the way the figure had moved, the way it had followed me without ever stepping into the light, and those whispers. I still don't know if they were real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. The next morning, I found myself staring out the window, half expecting to see the figure standing there again. It wasn't, but that didn't bring much comfort. Even now, I don't take naps on late-night walks anymore. I can't bring myself to go near the woods. The police never told me much else about the man they arrested, but I heard from a neighbor that he was taken to a psychiatric hospital. Sometimes I wonder, was he just a man who'd lost his way? Or was there something darker in those woods that had found him first? I was 14 when it happened. My mom worked long shifts as a nurse, often overnight, and my brother was at college. That left me alone in the house most weekends. At the time, it felt normal. Just another part of growing up. But that night taught me how vulnerable I was. It was a Saturday, and I'd invited Molly over. She was someone I'd been talking to a little more than a friend, though we hadn't put a label on it. We spent the evening watching movies in my room, laughing and joking around. My bedroom was upstairs with a window overlooking the backyard deck. Molly left around 10 p.m. because her parents didn't like her staying out too late. We hugged goodbye, and then I was alone again. I stayed in my room scrolling through my phone and half watching TV. The soft glow of the screen was comforting in the quiet house. At some point, I heard the sound of a chair scraping against the wooden deck below my window. It wasn't a subtle sound, it was deliberate, loud enough to make me freeze. Curious, I got up and looked out the window. A man was sitting in one of the deck chairs. His body was silhouetted in the dim light from the neighbor's porch. My first thought was that Molly had come back for some reason, but didn't he make sense? Still, I called her name softly through the window. The figure looked up at me. It wasn't Molly. My breath caught in my throat. It was a man, his face partially obscured by shadows, but I could tell he was staring right at me. His gaze felt invasive, like it pinned me in place. I ducked back behind the curtain, my heart pounding. Grabbing my phone, I texted a few friends in our group chat, asking if any of them were pulling some kind of sick prank. The replies came quickly, confused denials and jokes about me watching too many horror movies. I didn't believe it was them. None of my friends would come to my house just to scare me. They weren't that kind of people. But that only made things worse, because it meant this man was a stranger. My stomach churned with fear, but curiosity got the better of me. I crept back to the window and peeked out. He was still there sitting in the chair, staring at my window. It was dark, but I could see enough to know he wasn't moving. His presence felt deliberate, like he was waiting for something. I swallowed the lump in my throat and tried to sound brave as I called down to him. "What do you want?" At first, he didn't respond. Then his shoulders started shaking. It took me a moment to realize he was laughing, silent, wheezing laughter that sent shivers down my spine. The sound finally broke, a faint and breathy, like the wind whistling through cracks in a door. "Please go away," I shouted, trying to sound commanding, but my voice cracked, betraying my fear. He didn't move. Instead, he leaned back in the chair, his head tilted at an odd angle, as though mocking me. I slammed the window shut and drew the curtains, my hands trembling. My mind raced. Should I call the police? What would I even tell them? That a man was sitting in my backyard staring at me? It sounded ridiculous. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in danger. I retreated to my bed, curling into a ball with my arms wrapped around my knees. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the TV, which I hadn't turned off. I didn't dare make a sound. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I couldn't tell. The house was so quiet that every creak and groan of the old wood seemed deafening. Just when I started to convince myself that he was gone, I heard it, the sound of the back door handle being jiggled. My blood ran cold. He was trying to get inside. I bolted out of bed and crouched at the top of the stairs, straining to hear. The door rattled again, harder this time, followed by a faint thud, like he was testing the strength of the lock. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I pressed my hand over my mouth to avoid making a sound. Then it stopped. For a moment, I thought he'd given up. But the relief was short-lived. I heard him move around the side of the house, a crunch of gravel underfoot. My heart pounded as I realized he was heading for the front door. The sound of the doorknob twisting reached my ears, followed by a soft push against the door. Thankfully, the locks held. Tears stung my eyes as I scrambled back to my room and locked the door. I grabbed my phone, finally working up the courage to call anyone. But my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely dial. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the call button for 911. The front door creaked, then fell silent. I waited, ears straining for any sound. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Eventually, the house was quiet again. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed huddled in my bed, clutching my phone like a lifeline. When my mom finally came home around 9 o'clock a.m., I broke down and told her everything. She was furious that I hadn't called the police. Looking back, I know she was right, but at the time, I'd been paralyzed by fear. The man never came back. We never found out who he was or what he wanted. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed huddled in my bed, clutching my phone like a lifeline. When my mom finally came home around 9 o'clock a.m., I broke down and told her everything. She was furious that I hadn't called the police. Looking back, I know she was right, but at the time, I'd been paralyzed by fear. The man never came back. We never found out who he was or what he wanted. My whole adult life I have been a police officer. I've been working the 6 o'clock a.m. to 4 p.m. shift in Fairfax County, Reston, Virginia, for as long as I can remember. It wasn't the career I dreamed of after high school, but it paid the bills. Over the years, the job grew on me, especially because of the friendships I built with my colleagues. It was a regular day this past September, of sunny but not too hot. Around 10 o'clock a.m., a call came through at the station. A mental health professional requested a welfare check on a 33-year-old woman named Sydney Wilson. According to the report, she had been in an agitated state of mind and her behavior was a concern. I decided to take the call. Welfare checks are usually straightforward, knocking on the door, making sure everything is okay, and leaving once you confirm the person is safe. I drove to her apartment complex, a small building tucked away on a quiet street. The place looked like any other in the area, modest but well kept. When I got to the door, I knocked firmly and called out, "Police department, is anyone home?" After a few seconds, the door creaked open about halfway. A woman stood in the doorway, her eyes darting around like she was looking for something or someone. "Hi ma'am," I started. "I'm Officer Lou. I'm here to check on." Before I could finish, she mumbled something I couldn't make out, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I stood there for a moment, unsure what to make of her behavior. Was she scared, agitated? I wasn't sure, but it didn't feel right. I knocked again, louder this time, but there was no response. I kept knocking every 20 seconds or so, hoping she'd come back. After about 2 minutes, the door opened again. She stepped out slowly, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. "How are you?" she asked abruptly, her tone oddly cheerful. I barely had time to process the question before she swung a knife at me. The blade slashed across my forehead, and the pain hit me instantly. Stumbling backward, I tried to create some distance between us. My hand went to my head and I felt warm blood trickling down. She stood there, gripping the knife tightly, mumbling words I couldn't understand. I drew my gun, holding it steady as I shouted, "Drop the knife. Back up." She didn't move away. Instead, she stepped closer, her grip on the knife tightening. I backed up further, trying to keep my voice firm. "Drop the knife, I'm warning you," but my words didn't seem to reach her. She lunged at me again, slashing the knife across my face twice more. The stinging pain blurred my vision for a moment, but my training kicked in. Fearing for my life, I fired 2 shots, both missed, hitting the wall behind her. She didn't flinch. Instead, she grabbed at me, her movements erratic and frantic. I fired again, 3 more shots. This time, all 3 struck her in the upper body. She stumbled back, dropped the knife, and collapsed onto the floor. I immediately called for backup, with shots fired, a suspect down, requesting medical assistance, into my radio, giving my location as clearly as I could. My hands were slick with blood and I could feel it dripping down my face. Thankfully, it wasn't rapid, which meant the wounds weren't life-threatening. Within minutes, other officers arrived at the scene and paramedics were close behind. They rushed me to the hospital while another team tended to Sydney. As I sat in the ambulance, the adrenaline started to wear off, and the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I had shot someone. I had killed someone. At the hospital, doctors treated my wounds, several stitches for the deep cuts on my face and forehead. They assured me I would recover fully. Still, the emotional weight of the incident was harder to shake. I had never fired my weapon in the line of duty before, let alone taken a life. Later, I learned that Sydney had been pronounced dead at the hospital. The news hit me like a ton of bricks. I replayed the events in my mind over and over, questioning if I could have done something differently. But every time, the conclusion was the same: she had left me no choice. It was her or me. For days after the incident, I couldn't sleep well. I'd wake up shaking, haunted by the memory of her lunging at me with the knife. My colleagues were supportive, reminding me that I had acted in self-defense. Even so, it's one thing to know that logically, and another to feel it emotionally. I had to undergo the usual procedures after a shooting: interviews, internal reviews, and counseling sessions. Each step was a reminder of what had happened, but it also helped me process everything. Department ultimately ruled the shooting justified, but the experience stayed with me. I used to work as a caretaker for an old small church in a quiet town. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it had its peaceful moments. The church had been standing for over 100 years and looked exactly how you'd imagine. Tall, weathered, with a bell tower that rang at odd times and a cemetery right next to it. I would go there almost every day, cleaning, fixing things up, and making sure everything was in order. I knew the building inside and out, but there was always something about it that made me feel uneasy. Sigh. One afternoon, I was alone at the church as usual. The sun was setting, casting long shadows on the ground. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the trees near the cemetery started to sway back and forth, making soft creaking noises. It was strange, huh? There was a kind of silence around the place that felt different from other times. The air felt thick, like something was just about to happen. I was finishing up my work when I heard a faint sound coming from inside the church. It wasn't a normal sound, not the usual creaks and groans of an old building, but something else. At first, I thought it was just the wind blowing through the cracks in the walls. But the longer I stood still, the clearer it became. It sounded like voices, low and hurried, almost like whispers in a language I couldn't understand. That's when I noticed something else. Through the small window at the top of the church, I saw a figure, a small one, standing by the gate of the cemetery near the old iron door that led out to the road. The figure was so small it could only have been a child. But it was so still, and there was something wrong about the way it stood there in the fading light. I could barely make out the details, but I could tell it was a girl. My heart raced. My breath came faster. I couldn't take my eyes off her. I wanted to go outside and check, but something kept me rooted to the spot. The girl didn't move. She just stood there staring ahead, her tiny body barely visible in the shadows. I watched her for what felt like hours. But when I finally gathered the courage to go outside, she was gone. I walked over to the door of the church, my mind racing with confusion. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I had been working too hard, and the strange sounds had tricked me. But when I stepped outside, the cemetery was empty. There was no sign of the girl. I didn't know what to think. I went back inside the church and tried to shake off the feeling of unease. But the whispers I had heard before were still there. The voices had grown louder now, filling the space and bouncing off the walls. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, close, far away. Hi! Oh, it was like the church was alive. Breathing with voices I couldn't understand, I stepped back and stared at the altar. The flickering candlelight cast strange shadows on the walls, stretching and twisting in odd shapes. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it again. There was the figure of the same small girl standing in the corner near the old wooden pews. But this time, she was moving slowly, very slowly. She walked toward me. I froze, my feet planted on the floor. As she got closer, her face became more visible, pale, eyes wide open, staring directly at me. Her mouth was slightly open, but no sound came out. She wasn't smiling, but her expression was empty, blank, as though she wasn't really there. My heart beat faster, and I felt my body tense. What was happening? Who was she? Before I could even move, she stopped in front of me and pointed toward the cemetery. Her finger was trembling and her eyes never left mine. I didn't know what she wanted. I didn't know what to do. All I could do was stare back at her. Then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. I looked around in panic, but the church was empty again. The only sound was the wind outside. My body was shaking, I could feel the sweat running down my back. I couldn't explain what had just happened. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I ran out of the church, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I went straight to the cemetery, searching for any sign of the little girl, but there was nothing. No footprints. No sign of anyone. It was as if she had never been there at all. I stayed outside for a long time watching the cemetery, but there was nothing to see. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that place, something about the cemetery, the church, and the girl didn't sit right with me. I'm 30 years old, and I share a house with my sister. It's a 2-floor setup, one of those mother-daughter houses with separate kitchens. My sister has the downstairs apartment, and I take the upstairs. She's not home much though, since she often stays over at her boyfriend's place about 20 minutes away. I like to think I'm not someone who gets easily spooked, but sometimes being home alone in this big house unsettles me more than I'd care to admit. This particular night, I was home alone, lounging on my couch engrossed in a horror movie. My portion of the house is an open concept space, so the living room, kitchen, and dining area all blend together. The couch sits smack in the middle, meaning my back is to a large open room whenever I'm watching TV. The only light came from the TV's eerie glow. It made the shadows in the corners of the room seem alive. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder. Just a habit, I told myself. Something about the open space always made me feel like I wasn't entirely alone, but I chalked it up to the movie. It was one of those psychological thrillers that gets under your skin. After the movie ended, I brushed my teeth, turned off all the lights, and went to bed. I fell asleep quickly, but woke up around 1 a.m. to the sound of my sister's voice. At first, I thought I'd dreamed it. The voice wasn't muffled like it would have been if she were outside. It sounded like she was inside the house. It startled me awake. My sister's voice carried a distinct tone. It wasn't just calling out. It sounded frantic, almost angry, still groggy. I sat up and listened. Why is she yelling? I muttered to myself. My first thought was that maybe she and her boyfriend had an argument, and she'd come home upset. I shuffled out of bed and into the dark hallway, flipping on the light as I walked toward the staircase. I heard her again. She was calling my name, louder this time, from downstairs. "What is it?" I called back, my voice cutting through the stillness. She didn't answer, but the tone of her yelling unsettled me. It wasn't just urgent, it sounded off. Descending the stairs, I felt around for the light switch in the foyer. I couldn't find it. The darkness seemed thicker down here, and my half-asleep brain wasn't helping. "Where's the damn switch?" I said, fumbling along the wall. Her voice came again. This time it was louder and clearer. "Come here," she yelled. It was coming from her kitchen. My stomach dropped. Something about her tone felt wrong, like it wasn't entirely hers. I found the kitchen light switch and flipped it on. The fluorescent light flickered to life, starting to dim, then brightening. The light illuminated the entire downstairs apartment, the living room, kitchen, and part of her hallway. It was empty. "Hello," I called out, stepping further into the space. There was unnaturally still, the kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums. My pulse quickened as I walked toward her bedroom. Her door was ajar. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. The room was empty. Her bed was neatly made, her nightstand undisturbed. There was no sign that she'd come home at all. "Jasmine," I called out again, my voice wavering. Still no answer. As I turned to leave the room, I heard a loud thud. My heart jumped into my throat. The sound came from her room, the same room I had just checked, which was completely empty. I froze, my breath catching. My instinct screamed at me to get out, but curiosity, or stupidity, kept me rooted. Slowly, I stepped back into her room. The light from the hallway spilled in, casting faint shadows on the walls. I scanned the floor, expecting to see something that had fallen over. Nothing was out of place. The bed was undisturbed. The furniture exactly as it had been a moment ago. I backed out of the room, heart pounding, and hurried upstairs to my bedroom. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and grabbed my phone. My hands were trembling as I dialed Jasmine's number. The phone rang, but she didn't pick up. I tried again and again, no answer. I sat on my bed, staring at the locked door. Every creak of the house sent my imagination into overdrive. Was I losing my mind? Had I hallucinated all of this? I couldn't shake the vividness of her voice or the unsettling urgency in her tone. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I fell into a fitful sleep. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight streamed through my window. The terror of the night felt distant, like a bad dream. Until I checked my phone. Jasmine had texted me, "Why did you call me at 1 a.m.? Is everything okay?" My stomach twisted. I quickly replied, "Were you home last night?" "I thought I heard you downstairs." Her response came almost immediately, "No, I stayed at Matt's." I went downstairs to her apartment in the daylight, determined to make sense of what had happened. Her room was exactly as I'd left it, undisturbed. The kitchen and living room showed no signs of anyone having been there. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. On the floor near her bedroom door was a faint scuff mark. It hadn't been there the night before. And then I noticed something else. The air downstairs carried a faint acidic smell of something metallic, like rust or blood. I bolted upstairs, locked myself in my room, and spent the rest of the day convincing myself that I had imagined everything. This was the story of how I almost died as a young kid home alone, and possibly the most intense night of my life with way too much going on. We're a family of 5. I was 10 at the time, my older brother was 14, and my little sister was 5. It was a Friday night. My brother was out with his friends causing trouble, clearly because a dreaded phone call came to my parents. All I remember was that I was in my room playing a Star Wars video game when I heard my mom start freaking out and crying. I got really scared and hurried to see what was wrong. My mom was on the phone with a hospital calling to inform my parents that my brother had gotten hit by a car. Obviously, we were all shaken and really scared. My brother's leg was broken, but I don't know what else was said on the phone. All I know is that my parents hurried to get their coats on, grabbed my little sister from her room, and asked me if I was okay to stay home alone. I said yes, and they hurried out to the car and left. I was, of course, really worried for my brother, but I really didn't want to go to the hospital and see him in any kind of bad condition. I don't think my parents wanted me or my sister to either. But they didn't want to leave my 5-year-old sister home without them. It's worth mentioning that my brother recovered just fine, as his injury is no longer relevant to the story other than it being the reason why I was left home alone on a Friday night. Before my dad left, he was trying to calm down my mom, telling her that my brother was going to be okay. Seeing my dad like that made me feel better. I had a feeling my mom was just being overdramatic, like any mom would be. I continued playing the Star Wars game for a couple more hours when I heard the front door open. I had my bedroom door closed by this point. It was easily past midnight and my bedtime, so I turned off the TV and PlayStation and crawled into my bed with my Game Boy. I tried listening to hear my parents' voices, maybe hear if my brother was with them or just hear what they were saying, but I didn't hear anything. After a few minutes of not hearing them even come up the stairs, I had a feeling something was wrong. I walked to my door and opened it quietly, then proceeded to walk over to the ledge in the banister which overlooked my living room. The lights were off, but there were 3 tall people standing in my living room. They weren't my family. I was so petrified that I was frozen for a second before I could quietly walk back into my room and shut the door as quietly as I could in my trepidation. But it wasn't quite enough, and I knew they had to have heard the door click shut, even if just slightly. I hurried to my closet, opened the door quietly, stepped inside, then shut the door. I had myself sitting behind a bunch of boxes and bags of clothes that were stuffed in my closet. I was actually pretty covered from view. There was a short period that felt like forever as I anticipated my bedroom door opening, and it did. At that moment, I knew I was going to die. I heard footsteps walk into the room. I couldn't tell how many people it was, maybe 1 or 2. I heard the footsteps move to my bed, and I heard my covers being played with, then silence. Then more footsteps, this time toward the closet door, then silence for a few seconds, which felt like grains of sand slowly dropping into an hourglass. Then the closet door opened. By this point, my heart was in my throat. All I did was sit there quietly and hold my breath. The door remained open for a long time, but I didn't look up. I didn't move. It had to be a good 20 seconds of silence before the door closed again. Footsteps walked away from the door and then out of the room. I finally looked up and realized that from where I was huddled down behind the sacks and boxes, perhaps I was visible to that individual. It wasn't until probably an hour later that I heard my parents return. I ran downstairs to them. The front door was left ajar by the people who broke in, and they had stolen several valuables from our house. It was a night that just went from bad to worse for our family. My parents were in such a rush when they left for the hospital that they apparently didn't even lock the door. I was lucky to have not been killed or kidnapped. I look back now and wonder if the person who opened the closet and just stood there for 20 seconds saw me hiding in there. Maybe he was just a guy who came to rob a house, not to kidnap or hurt a child. Or maybe he just didn't see me. and I narrowly escaped death or injury. It was a cold evening in November 2021, and I decided to take my dog Max for a late-night walk. We live in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Texas, not far from the woods. I've always liked how peaceful it is at night, just the wind, the rustling leaves, and the occasional hoot of an owl. But that night was different. Max and I walked down the familiar path, his leash loose in my hand as he sniffed around. Everything was normal until we reached the edge of the woods. That's when Max froze. He stood perfectly still, his body tense, and let out a low growl. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw a dark figure standing motionless at the tree line. My first thought was that it might be a lost hiker. People occasionally wandered into these woods and got turned around. I called out, "Hey, do you need help?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't even move. It just stood there, a shadow against the darker backdrop of the trees. I couldn't make out any details, no face, no features, just a tall dark shape. My chest tightened, but I told myself not to overreact. Maybe they were scared or confused. "Max, let's go," I said, tugging gently on his leash. He hesitated but eventually followed me as I started walking back toward home. That's when I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The figure was moving. Not walking exactly, but shifting, gliding, almost staying just at the edge of the tree line. Every time I stopped, it stopped. When I started walking again, it followed. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe the way the shadows moved with the wind. My hands started to shake, and Max growled again. A deep rumbling sound I'd never heard from him before. By the time we reached my street, I was practically jogging, my breath clouded in the cold air. I kept looking over my shoulder, but the figure never left the trees. It just stood there watching. When I got to my house, I fumbled with the keys, my fingers clumsy from the cold and panic. Finally, I got the door open, and Max and I rushed inside. I locked the door, double-checked it, and turned off all the lights. I stood there in the dark, my heart pounding, listening. The house was silent except for the sound of Max's heavy breathing. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that whoever or whatever it was had stayed in the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. In 2023, I lived in a tough part of New York City. The streets were noisy during the day but unsettlingly quiet at night. I worked the late shift at a small office downtown, finishing around 11 p.m. Most nights it wasn't the safest routine, but it paid my rent. One cold November evening, I was heading to work. The underground parking lot where I kept my car was dimly lit and nearly empty as usual. I parked near the entrance and grabbed my bag, ready to start my shift. As I walked toward the elevator, something caught my eye. A man stood near a car a few rows away. At first I thought he might be unlocking his car, but his movements seemed strange, slow and deliberate, like he was trying to pry the door open. I paused for a moment, unsure if I should say something or keep walking. Before I could decide, the man looked up and saw me. His face was shadowed under the dim light, but I could feel his gaze. He didn't move at first, he just stood there staring. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the exit. His steps were quick but steady, like he didn't want to draw attention. I felt a storm of unease that told myself to focus on work. The rest of my shift was uneventful. I typed reports, answered emails, and tried to forget about the man in the parking lot. By the time I finished, I was ready to head home and get some rest. When I returned to the parking lot, it was even quieter than before. My footsteps echoed as I approached my car. I glanced around, expecting to see someone, maybe that man, but the lot was empty. I unlocked my car and got in, locking the doors immediately. Something about the silence felt heavier than usual, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I started the engine and pulled out of the lot. Eager to get home, the drive home was uneventful at first. The streets were mostly empty, and the soft hum of my car filled the quiet. The highway stretched ahead, bordered by dark trees that seemed to press closer the further I went. About 10 minutes in, I thought I heard a faint noise behind me. It was soft, like the rustle of fabric or a small shift in weight. My heart skipped, but I brushed it off. The car is just settling, I muttered to myself, keeping my eyes on the road. But then I heard it again, this time louder. A distinct sound, like someone moving. My chest tightened. I wasn't alone. I glanced at the rearview mirror, and my blood ran cold. There, in the shadows of the back seat, was the man from the parking lot. He was sitting there, his eyes fixed on me, his face blank but tense. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I didn't know what to do. Should I stop the car, speed up? Before I could make a decision, he spoke. "Keep driving," he said calmly, but there was an edge to his voice that made my stomach turn. I obeyed, my thoughts spinning. How had he gotten into my car? Had he been there the whole time? "Pull over by the trees," he ordered, motioning to a dark, isolated spot on the side of the road. I swallowed hard and did as he said, hoping he would just take what he wanted and leave. Once the car stopped, he pulled out a gun, wallet, phone, he demanded, his voice still unnervingly calm. I handed them over without hesitation, my hands shaking. He didn't say anything else, and just stared at me for a moment before opening the door and stepping out. Before disappearing into the trees, he turned back and said, "If you call the cops, I'll find you." Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I sat there for what felt like hours, my breathing shallow and my heart pounding. Finally, I managed to start the car and drive to the nearest gas station. The bright lights felt like a sanctuary after the darkness of the highway. Inside, I told the cashier what had happened and asked to use the phone. He handed it over without a word, his eyes wide with concern. The police arrived quickly, and I recounted everything: the man in the parking lot, how he must have hidden in my car, the robbery. They searched the area near the trees but found no sign of him. "You're lucky he didn't hurt you," one officer said, his tone serious. I nodded, still shaken. The drive home that night was one of the longest of my life. Every shadow on the road seemed to move, and every sound made me jump. When I finally got home, I double-checked every lock on my doors and windows, still feeling like he might somehow show up again. For weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started checking my car thoroughly every time I got in, even in broad daylight. The thought of someone hiding so close without me knowing haunted me. I never saw the man again, but the fear stayed with me. It wasn't just about the robbery, it was about how easily he had slipped into my life, how close he had been without me realizing it. That kind of fear doesn't go away. It lingers like a shadow in the corner of your mind, reminding you that some dangers are closer than you think.